Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another AP Euro live hangout. We are here tonight. I have the pleasure of being joined by Chris Freiler for the third year in a row, and it's always good to have him on here when we're getting ready for the AP exam. You know, a lot of people watch my videos. They don't necessarily realize that as far as this goes. Every once in a while, I have the pleasure of having somebody on here that's been doing this for a lot longer than me, that is a lot more experienced than I am. Oops, I've got something that I've got to turn off here. Okay. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I've been teaching Euro for about 9 years. Chris has been doing that a lot longer than I have. Chris has also been on the AP Euro committee that redesigned the exam. He's been the assistant chief reader, a question leader, all kinds of stuff that I've never done before. So, if you've been watching my videos, it's like, I'm Obi-Wan Kenobi and I'm about to introduce you to Master Yoda, and he's written a prep book. So, just all kinds of great stuff's going to happen tonight. All right. Looks like we're starting off with about 150 people. Make sure you tell your friends, okay, because we're going to get some good stuff talked about here. I will be taking questions via Twitter. So, when we get to the Q&A portion, make sure you get on Twitter for that. You're welcome to talk in the chat, but, all of you, I'm not going to be monitoring that very closely because, it always gets dominated by just all kinds of crazy people. Okay. So if you have questions, make sure you ask on Twitter, because I'm not really going to be monitoring the chat. All right. So ladies and gentlemen, joined here by Chris Freiler, going to pass it to him and let him tell you a little bit about himself and his experience with AP Euro and also his book.
Thanks, Tom. I'm glad to be here. And I'm glad all the students and some maybe teachers are joining us tonight. So as far as just specifically the review book, I think it's really nice to have a resource for students and teachers to be able to take 550 years of history plus in all the different countries and be able to bring it all together and identify the most important course themes, and also to be able to have some materials to practice with, some testing materials. So what I've tried to do is use my involvement with the College Board, and both in terms of designing the course and helping to develop the test, and also my experience at the reading, to be able to kind of provide some insight into how the exam is constructed, how it's scored, and maybe what to focus on in terms of the course. Can you still hear me, Tom? Maybe having some technical difficulties.
All right, let's see. Let me check on Chris here. Sorry, it looks like we've had a little bit of technical difficulty, as happens sometimes. Okay, let's see. Okay, Chris is still here. Okay.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
No, it looks like that was on my end, Chris. So yeah, wherever I introduced you, and then it cut me off. So whatever, but it looks like we're still live. We didn't lose the feed, at least. So if it was letting you talk, then we should be fine. But yeah, let's go ahead and just kind of continue as if nothing ever happened.
Okay. Well, I was just talking about what the purpose of the review book is, and I think students who've taken AP exams before, or even if this is your first exam, there's a lot of pressure and intensity when you get down to crunch time. So we're about 2 months away from the AP Euro test, which luckily is the last one this year on May 18th. So that gives students more time to prepare. So I think it's really helpful to be able to have a resource that breaks the course down. Certainly a student could try to reread their textbook, but that's going to be a major investment. I'm not sure that's the best strategy. So I tried to make the review book so that it was thorough enough so that it would cover any possible required content on the test, but also distill it down so that it was a more manageable length, and also give some focus to the way the exam is structured. So some of your students may know and teachers may know that there is an official book. I actually have a copy here, this one, which is the sort of Bible, Quran, Torah of the course. And basically what that does is it identifies all the major themes, key concepts, and required content that students need to know for the exam. So I use that to guide the way in which I structured the review book. So students should feel pretty confident and comfortable that if they use the review book in the proper way, that it is addressing pretty much everything that might be covered on the exam. In addition to the tips about how to approach studying, how to tackle the different parts of the test, especially the rubric guided writing practices, the DBQ and the LEQ. So that's just kind of a general overview. I don't know if there's any other further questions that you might have, Tom, or anybody else in the audience.
Now, Chris, there's of course been some discussion, like, your book was published in 2017. Okay, so there have been a few changes that have been made to the exam from the 2017 administration to the administration that's coming up. So, right. What is it? I mean, is your prep book still useful with these changes that have been made?
Yeah, I think so. And maybe you can share later. I created an update memo. So what that does is it supplements the textbook. It's not particularly long. It's about 15 to 20 pages, and it identifies for students some of the changes in the test format, some changes also in the skills section, and also there was a new course theme that was added. So I tried to lay that out and explain how that course theme works and the way in which it might guide through questions. So I think the book is still quite useful. There's obviously other products out in the market. So I guess I've looked at many of those. And what I hope is different about my review book is that many of those people who created those books haven't really been involved with the AP program. And so some of the questions may not necessarily be the actual format of particularly the multiple choice stimulus-based questions, because there's a certain way in which those have to be written. For example, all the right answers have to be in what's called the concept outline of the book that I held up before. And you really do need to use the stimulus to be able to both answer the question and then use your content knowledge at the same time.
Yeah, and Chris, that's been a big thing, as a teacher that I've had to deal with. Sometimes, I'm working with a tutoring client who wants me to help them with, oh, these are some questions I got wrong on my multiple choice. And then when I look at the questions, yes, they've got a stimulus and they've got a question with 4 answer choices, but it's not in the same format. It doesn't have the same feel to it. It may be more of like a straight up ACT reading comprehension type test. So, one thing that I think is like really valuable about this book, and, Chris was kind of modest about it and glossed over, but just because somebody wrote a prep book for AP Euro doesn't mean that they were involved in writing the exam. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're intimately acquainted with the exam. And so I think that Chris brings a lot of experience there. Like you said, there are other prep books on the market, but I've looked through this one and I found that it's really helpful. It gets right to the point on a lot of things, especially for people who are trying to be efficient with their review. Now, Chris did mention that he's got a supplement that he's published. And if you're watching at tomrichey.net/Euro, you can go to my website here, go to courses, European history, and just click there on the main page. or just tomrichey.net/euro, I've got a couple of links. You can buy the book on Amazon. Now, Amazon shows that it's out of stock. Now, I've had people buy the book and it ends up shipping to them, even though it says it's out of stock. So I don't know if that's just some kind of bug or what. We're still about 2 months away, so you can certainly try it. Now, there's also a link to buy it directly from the publisher's website. Now, I believe that this is a little bit cheaper than Amazon, but if I'm not mistaken, there's probably going to be a shipping and handling fee added to that. So it's probably going to be about the same price, whether you go to the publisher's website or Amazon. But I have direct links here. Now, also, ladies and gentlemen, make sure if you want to know when I'm broadcasting, sign up for my email list, for my AP Euro students email list, and that will keep you in the loop. Anytime I'm broadcasting, I'll let the email list know about it. And also, there are some other things that I'm going to send out to people on the email list that I don't send other places. So what you can also get here is this 2018 update supplement. All right. So Chris wrote this specifically for people who are, using this prep book, but they want to be acquainted with the changes in the exam. And so, for example, when we look at what's going on here, we see here that you'll see in the prep book that the synthesis point is there. And the synthesis point has been eliminated, at least as a must-do point. It looks like there are some back doors, but that's no longer there. Now, also, there used to be 4 kinds of LEQs, and, one of them was periodization. That was eliminated, but as Chris notes, when we look at continuity and change over time prompts, that goes into that, when you've got a turning point there, typically in a continuity change over time prompt. But, we see here that there are a lot of things here that there's been no change. This exam wasn't so much redesigned this year, but it was kind of tweaked. Chris, do you have any feedback on here? Anything you might want to bring special attention to?
No, I'd just say that when students are writing the longer essay questions, not the short answer questions, but the LEQ, the long essay, and the DBQ, it's not enough to just know the history. Obviously that is certainly helpful because these are content-driven questions. But the student really needs to know the rubric and practice applying the rubric to the questions. And in my experience, that's not something that you can just do once or twice. Hopefully your teacher has provided you opportunities for that. If not, then you could use a review book like this one or others to be able to practice writing, and maybe find someone, whether it's your teacher or someone else who is familiar with the rubric, to help you with that. So I think the main focus for me for the long essays and the DBQs is to remember to make an argument. So ultimately, the test is really for students to be apprentice historians and to use evidence to advance an argument. So usually those more complex tasks that used to be called synthesis and now are called argument and reasoning is essentially the student recognizing that when they're making an argument, they need to consider counterclaims to their own argument and be able to address evidence. For example, in the DBQ. So if you use some of the documents in the DBQ to advance an argument, a DBQ is always going to have evidence that cuts both ways. And so rather than ignoring the evidence that doesn't support your position, it's usually a good idea for students to engage with that evidence and not necessarily make a thesis which is wishy-washy and says it's some of both, but explains, even if they take position X, that there is evidence to support position Y and to be able to address it. Just like if you were debating someone, you would acknowledge their points and then respond to them.
And of course, Chris, what you're getting into there is this new complex understanding point, right? Which is kind of one of the things when somebody can see, the nuance and the different sides of what comes there. And, so Chris, when you talk about building an argument, like you address that in the book, basically step by step, kind of how to write these essays in an argumentative form.
Right. So just for example, last year's DBQ was on whether the Glorious Revolution was really part of the Enlightenment. So in reading some of those essays, first of all, you can't just announce your position and say, yes, it was part of the Enlightenment. You have to give reasons for why you're taking that position. But I'm sure students earn the complexity point, which is what I'll call it, if they said that it was part of the Enlightenment by engaging with evidence which showed that it wasn't. So, for example, there were some documents that argued, or at least took the position, that the Glorious Revolution was primarily about protecting the Protestant religion of England during that time period, which really isn't an Enlightenment principle. So rather than just ignoring that, a student who's effectively addressing the complexity part of of this rubric would have engaged with that question, explained, even though religion was a part of it, they would say that the concerns of, let's say, social contract theory or defending of rights or limiting the monarchy's power was the more important feature of the Glorious Revolution.
All right. And yeah, so and one thing that I wanted to note about last year's prompt, it was the prompt was set up, evaluate whether or not the Glorious Revolution was part of the Enlightenment. Now, one thing that you need to note when you go into this exam, even if the prompt doesn't specifically ask for nuance, the prompt said like evaluate whether or not. Now, thankfully, most students seem to understand that it wanted like evidence on, both sides and kind of some counterclaims and such, but make sure that you always know to, to do this, when you're writing. So, definitely, take a look at that book. Also, people on my email list, I have a sample chapter of the book. So when I follow up after this, if you're on my email list, I will send you a sample like excerpt so that you can see if you're thinking about buying the book. I'll let you see this excerpt so that you can see, do I want to buy the rest of it? Okay. So you can
Tom,
see
if I could add one more point. So students should expect, especially the DBQ question, will take that same kind of a format. It might be an either or. So it's really inviting a student to take a clear position. And the old format of the DBQ would say, analyze, various attitudes about X, which doesn't really lead to an argument. It was just sorting documents into groups. And even the LEQs, I think, are moving more in that direction. So it's just a reminder, students, like, take a position, give reasons for your position, and also engage with opposing arguments to your position. I think if you just follow that basic format, you're very likely to meet the points of the rubric.
All right, excellent. And Chris, I'm starting to look at Twitter. Gosh, the conversation in the chat is of course entertaining. The defenestration of Prague is a meme and all kinds of other stuff. Looks like Nicholas set up a Twitter account just to follow me here and ask his questions. So let's go ahead and take that. This is Chris. This is asking, how important is the knowledge of English history? For example, how much do we need to know about the English Revolution and all of the kings and queens?
Well, again, I would say the course and exam description, the so-called yellow book, which is available at the AP Central site, maybe your teachers have made it available to you, is really your best first look to decide how much detailed knowledge do I have to know. So I would not turn the course into a memorization of English monarchs. I don't really think that's the best strategy. Obviously, there's plenty of English history, and I think what you need to do is connect it and tie it in with the themes. So, for example, a moment where England plays a large role would be the Industrial Revolution. So you'd want to look at what are the reasons why England was the first country to industrialize, what are some of the industrial processes, what are some of the social problems and some of the responses. But then obviously that's going to connect to other continental countries, and it offers opportunities for, let's say, contrasting the industrialization of England from the industrialization of the continent. As far as like specific monarchs mentioned in the course and exam description, I might be correct in saying the only two that I can think of are Elizabeth I and Henry VIII. And beyond that, doesn't mean you shouldn't know the other monarchs. Like Victoria can be useful for understanding, Britain at the turn of the 20th century and the Victorian age. But I just wouldn't turn the course into like kind of a flashcard mentality of just lining up monarchs. And I'd focus more on the course themes, and then pull the content up to show that you understand those broader developments.
Yeah, and one thing that I typically I try to work with my students with, like what I call drive-by evidence. This doesn't really work on the exam anymore. That when you're using a piece of evidence, you really have to know a lot about it. So when it comes to the Reformation, it would be best to know 5 things about the Reformation and know them really well and be able to describe them, rather than what Chris calls this flashcard mentality. That let me just say one quick thing about it and then move on. So, when we think about things like, on the DBQ last year, certainly would have been, helpful to know about, William and Mary, James II, if you remembered him, if he's brought up, great. But, yeah, it's like if you try to start memorizing all these different monarchs, you could get yourself into trouble. But start thinking about how significant is this? And, is this something that really made an impact? Can I explain this impact? And that's really what would make somebody important. And so let's see what we've got here. Now, the thing is, Trey, I would, Trey's asking, how does this book compare to a Princeton review or other test prep materials? Now, of course, Trey, if we were to ask, Chris, I mean, if we were to apply point of view analysis here, I mean, of course, he thinks that his book has something to offer here, that these books don't. And I think that, as I was saying earlier, it's just, I can vouch for Chris, like just having, seen what he does, like, as far as, when teachers go to learn to teach AP European history, like they'll go to a workshop and like Chris will be teaching it, so I don't know who wrote the Princeton Review book, might be somebody great. But the other thing is, if you look at the price point of this one, I mean, it may cost a little bit more. Sometimes that's a good thing. If the one that costs a little bit more can be a good, that can be a good sign sometimes. So Trey, you and I have been friends a long time on Twitter. Just take my word for it. This is a great book, but I'll be sending the email list a chapter here. Kyle, it is not confirmed that I'll be going to Bucks County. Now, if you're in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, it is confirmed that I will be going to the Fort Worth area on March 31st. Now, come on, ladies and gentlemen, we have got about 250 people in here, and I'm not seeing those questions come in on Twitter at Tom Richey. Okay, send in those questions. We want to help you. We want to take these questions. Okay. Oh my goodness, Jordan Davidson. Just okay. Thank you, Jordan, for the compliment and all of that kind of stuff. Let's see what we've got here. How did the neo-imperialism of the late 1800s play a role in setting the mood for catastrophic 1910s Europe? Jordan, this almost has the feel of a question that is like you're getting me to do your LEQ homework for you. But yeah, so it sounds like Jordan's about at the turn of the 20th century. And so, when we think about imperialism as destabilizing Europe leading to World War I, Chris, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, well, it's some sort of an indirect cause, because obviously World War I began over, issues in the Balkans about ethnic minorities and obviously competition among the great powers. But I think I would say in two ways: the pursuit of colonies destabilized, Bismarck's alliance system, and also led to the formation of the two alliance systems that were the basis for the First World War. I think it increased tensions among the great powers. I also think it fed into that whole social Darwinist mentality, and maybe made European nations much more preoccupied with nationalism and race, which probably leads to, when the crisis occurred in 1914, the inability or unwillingness to compromise on issues because of the tensions that had built up over time over colonies.
All right. And, as far as that, like, let's see. Now, sometimes what I do as well, like when we're talking about imperialism, I'll think about like, you've got that internal empire of, Austria as well, which is, just as he said, in the Balkans, like a huge destabilizing influence. Now, as far as the decline of the Ottoman Empire, Kyle, I haven't, I don't typically see like Chris, I've never, I've seen a Greek independence DBQ, but, the Ottomans are there, but I've never really seen anything centric on the exam. That's kind of rare. But as far as if there's anything a student should know about the Ottoman Empire, I mean, it's not an area of expertise. I mean, it's around the late 17th century. It's going in a permanent decline. But what would be something that you can share with our friend here that would be helpful for him on the exam?
Sure. I would say there was an LEQ, or was it called FRQs then, a couple of years ago, about the Ottoman Empire. I think the Ottoman Empire is one of those great powers that's mentioned in terms of the diplomacy of Europe, but usually knowledge internally about the structure of the Ottoman Empire is generally not required. So I think it's obviously really critical in the run-up to the First World War. And then also, it's kind of at the heart of some of the problems in the Middle East when it was, partitioned and not partitioned, but some of its territories were placed under British and French control under the mandate system. But I just would say I wouldn't preoccupy yourself too much with the internal condition of the Ottoman Empire. Just think of it mostly as a diplomatic source, a diplomatic entity in Europe that needs to be taken into account because it complicates the structure of diplomacy in Europe throughout much of European history.
Okay, yeah, and I guess the Crimean War would be an example of this, that
Sure.
it's like the decline of the Ottoman empires leading for Russia to grab a little land, and then Britain and France have to restore the balance of power. So yeah, I mean, sort of on the periphery of stuff that's going on there. So now Olivia wants to compare and contrast Italian and German unification. Now, of course, Olivia, we've got the obvious nationalism here. As far as Italy and Germany, which you can kind of contrast this from Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary, you had 10 different ethnic groups living within one political state, whereas in Italy and Germany, you've got a single, language, ethnic group that shares a language. They're living in several political communities. Now, both Italian and German unification, start really kind of inspired by the isms, like when you think about the revolutions of 1848, where you've got in Italy, Mazzini's more romantic nationalism. Then the Germans, they tried in 1848 with the Frankfurt Parliament to create a more like liberal nationalism, but the King of Prussia wasn't having any of it. And so after that, after the revolutions of 1848, both of those independence movements really took on a more pragmatic tack. Now, of course, in Italy, you've got Cavour, and of course, Garibaldi goes over to Cavour, even though he doesn't really like him necessarily, but he's like, you know what, I'll accept a king if we'll have a united Italy. And then, of course, in Germany, you've got Bismarck, and Bismarck, of course, with his real politics. So in both of these situations, you've got a certain, an ethnic group that shares a common language, but not common borders. They want to unite, but it's finally really pragmatism in the late 19th century that's going to kind of bring that together. Anything you want to add to that, Chris?
Sure. I think an interesting comparison, which is sometimes overlooked, is that both of those powers had to eliminate Austrian influence to be able to unify their countries. And it's kind of overlooked, but Austria then, within a span of 10 years, loses 2 wars of unification, which causes even more internal dissent and forces them to acknowledge the autonomy of the Magyars, creating the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So I think that's a major kind of reordering, reshuffling of the great powers of Europe. And obviously, the unification of Germany just completely upsets the balance of power. And, it's hard to imagine the 2 world wars of the 20th century occurring without the unification of Germany.
And so, ladies and gentlemen, let's see. I think that Caroline has a question. What is the best schedule to start reviewing for the AP exam? Now, as I've mentioned, Chris's prep book is, a lot of people ask me, like, Richey, what prep book do you recommend? Well, this is the prep book I recommend. As far as a schedule, I've got a schedule on my website. If you go to tomrichey.net/Euro, there is a 10-week study plan where I'm still kind of working on some of the fine tuning, but, if you're going to study this over 10 weeks. I've got, we'd be in week 2 if we're doing this. And right now, if you follow that plan, you'd be studying the Reformation right now and just kind of moving through it, with as much time as you can get into it. So remember, tomrichey.net/Euro, take a look at that. And I've got a question here from Chris from Lil Waffle. Lil Waffle, that's quite a Twitter there. And so I need to look at my Instagram DMs and look at the 3 memes that you made for me. I will get to that, but I think Lil Waffle actually had a question here. Okay. Could I do a quick summary of the Russian Revolution? That'd be great. So we've got, he sends me 3 memes. We'll figure out, Chris, what are, since he sent me 3 memes, what are like, 3 things that somebody should take out of the Russian Revolution? I mean, I know it's a very complicated topic. I still haven't gotten around to doing a proper lecture on it. But what are 3 takeaways that you could get out of the Russian Revolution?
Well, that's good. I just finished a book on the Russian Revolution today, so perfect timing. I would say first, to explain it, you need to look at the long-term causes that go way back into Russian history, and then especially look at its economic, social, and political development in the 19th century, and especially the reforms that were attempted by Alexander II and what impact those had on creating revolutionary groups, and in some ways even further destabilizing both the agriculture of Russia, and then also creating some new issues related to industrialization. Then I would look at the impact of the First World War on Russian history and kind of consider, maybe for argumentative purposes, was it the First World War that really was the straw that broke the camel's back? Or is it possible that Russia could have, if they had fought the war more effectively, maybe avoided the revolution? And then I would just look at how the Bolsheviks were able to take control of Russia, even though they were a minority group, and what techniques they used to consolidate their power, which also raises the question of the changes and continuities in Russian history. Even though the Bolsheviks completely eradicated the old Tsarist regime, how different are they really in terms of their methods of rule? I mean, they both used secret police forces. They both quelled dissent. They both essentially created almost like a state police force that didn't allow freedom of expression. So obviously they had different motives in some ways, but they also used some of the similar methods.
Okay, so from what I'm hearing, Chris, we need to keep in mind that the Bolsheviks didn't overthrow a truly like liberal state that had all kinds of civil liberties and rights and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think, some would argue it could have evolved in that direction, but clearly it hadn't evolved enough to gain public support to avoid both the Russian Revolution and then the Bolshevik Revolution.
And another thing that, that would be helpful as well, I'm a big fan of timelines, that note that you've got these, you've got a 1905 revolution, which is basically, right after the Russo-Japanese War, where they're finally having a constitutional monarchy. Okay. So 1905, when this is happening in other places, 300 years earlier, 200 years, 200, 300 years earlier. And so as far as that goes, then you've got two revolutions in 1917. So you've got that provisional government and then the Bolsheviks. And of course, a lot of interesting historiography. Dr. Marks from Clemson came in and talked to my class last year. And, I'd never really heard the stuff as far as, the debate over whether Russia was on its way to breaking or not when World War I happened. They had a stable banking system and all kinds of stuff like that. Let's see what else we've got here. Now, Erlo flashcards. I mean, I think flashcards have their place. I mean, there's a certain amount of like trivia that goes into any kind of history test. But, as Chris was mentioning, make sure that, the stuff that you've got, that you're getting out of this, that you're actually working on deep knowledge as well, which is why I think students that want to get want to use a prep book, that is, that's always a good thing. Now, Chris, there's this person on Twitter just keeps sending me this question every time I do a live hangout. I have no idea what this is. The diplomatic revolution of 1756.
Yeah.
You have anything to say on this? This kid's really persistent.
Sure. Yeah. So throughout the first half of the course, French foreign policy is really guided by anti-Habsburg sentiment because at some points they're essentially surrounded by Habsburgs. So the Habsburgs are the kings of Spain. They're the Holy Roman Emperors. They control some territories in northern Italy. They also control the Habsburg lands of the former Burgundy. So it's like the Spanish Netherlands and then later the Austrian Netherlands. So it was just basically taken as a given that French foreign policy was driven by opposing the Habsburgs. So in 1756, the Austrians, after having lost the War of Austrian Succession to Prussia, decided to try to talk Austria into, or the Austrians talked the French into forming an alliance with them, which included also Russia as well. So this kind of flip-flopped the sides during the War of Austrian Succession for the upcoming 7 Years' War. And interesting part of that is to sort of cement that alliance. The French married off Louis XVI to Marie Antoinette of Austria, and that turned out to be a very unpopular alliance in French history for a number of different reasons, because the war didn't turn out the way they intended, and obviously the marriage didn't yield a successful result because of the French Revolution.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, like I said, I mean, it's just, Obi-Wan Kenobi sent Luke to Dagobah for a reason. All right. So, I mean, you're getting some great stuff here, and really just a taste of what what you'll get if you check out that book. Now, I do have a sample chapter here that I'm going to project real quick, and then we'll take a few more questions. We'll sign off somewhere between 8:45 and 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern. But just wanted you to take a look here now. Chris, just correct me if I've got. I mean, I'm pretty sure this is the current version, right?
Yeah, and so what you see there is it's an intro to the chapter, the content, and then it also shows the connections to the key concepts. And then I have features on the side that try to connect it to the themes of the course, and then also some historical reasoning skills that are connected and built into there as well, and also how students can use examples to anticipate what kinds of essay questions might come up, because I didn't want to overwhelm with examples. So anything that you see that's underlined is what's called an illustrative example, and anything that's in bold is a required content that could be the answer to a multiple choice question. So what I tried to do, and this is what you won't find in some of the other review books, is I literally just had that course and exam description in front of me and just used it to guide the way in which I organized this. So you can see there, Columbian Exchange is required content knowledge. And then all of those underlying examples would just be ways in which a student could illustrate their understanding of how the Columbian Exchange actually affected both the Americas and also Europe.
And as far as the person who asked about flashcards, which I love, the little trivia app that I sell, Romulus Euro. Check it out at the App Store and on Google Play. But when you're looking through here, this is going beyond flashcards and really putting like the information in context. And I think there's something to be said for reading a narrative paragraph. So it's like how the compass and the quadrant, the astrolabe, the lateen sails, how all of those things affected the age of exploration and made it possible. But you're getting all these things together. And, especially the way that this exam's set up now is taking information, taking isolated bits of information and putting them together is really critical here. Like I said, I will send this to my email, to the students on my email list, and also the teachers on my list as well when I send up a follow-up email later this week. Okay, so I will be sending this out to the email list. So make sure you go to tomrichey.net/Euro and sign up if you're an AP Euro student. And so as far as that goes, let's go see if we can take a few more questions from Twitter. Now, we've got a lot of questions coming in. Sorry, we can't get to everybody tonight. Let's see. So Caden, okay, is wanting me to shout out to Miss Katskiewicz, AP Euro class. Excellent. Okay. Now, remember that we can't really predict like German and Italian unification. It's really when you think about somebody's asking like which one's more likely to be on the exam. I mean, any given year's exam is a game of Russian roulette, which, gosh, somebody's going to still shot this and make up a meme again. That pose is probably not something I should strike very often. But as far as this goes, if I were taking the exam year after year after year, then we could analyze probability because I'd be taking it multiple times and getting multiple samples, but you're only going to take the exam once. So instead of worrying, oh, which one's more likely to be on the exam, make sure you got some stuff about both of them. I mean, some people, when the exam comes out, some people are going to be lucky. Some people aren't going to be so lucky. And so as far as this goes, let's see what we've got here. All right. Yes, Seth, it was nice meeting you as well in Kenosha. Let's see, Chris, as far as Renaissance art and literature, okay, now this is a fair question. As far as what's more likely to be on the exam, German or Italian unification, we don't know year to year. But as far as, Chris, as far as Renaissance art and literature, where can we really, really help as far, like what advice would you offer on just some key Renaissance art and literature?
Yeah, so that actually helps me make another point that some people might overlook. And that is that there's been a change in the structure of the chronological scope of the test. So the only part of the test where it will be required that students have knowledge of the period before 1600 is the multiple choice. So on the SAQs, they will have an option for the third SAQ to choose an earlier time period or a later time period. Same thing with the LEQ, and the DBQ will never be on a topic that's prior to 1600. So I certainly teach the early part of the course. It's one of my favorite parts of the course. But in terms of studying, this might help you prioritize your time. So I would not spend a lot of time poring over Renaissance artists. I believe there's only one or two that are mentioned, and also literary figures. I know Machiavelli's mentioned. I think maybe Michelangelo is mentioned. But I think the key here is more understanding the approach of Renaissance art and the way it kind of sets the stage for future intellectual developments related to sort of what's called the objective knowledge and subjective visions theme. But again, I just wouldn't sit down and memorize 15, Italian Renaissance humanists. That's probably not the best use of your time. Now, if you know them, that's great. But the better question is, how can you connect them to understanding and defining the Renaissance as an intellectual movement that sets the stage for other intellectual movements?
Now, Chris, what do you think about because they have made this change this year. I see kind of a window if somebody wanted to adopt an early strategy. Now, of course,
I think it's great.
Yeah, the LEQ is only worth, 15% of the exam, but one of the three LEQs is going to come from the period before 1648. So, from what I've seen, it's very critical for teachers to emphasize period, 2 and 3, the 1648 to 1914, but there's kind of some leeway, it seems like, on both sides of the course. If somebody either decides to just gloss over the first part, or if they don't quite finish, then I think you've got a chance at passing either way.
Yeah, I think it's actually a good idea to, like, as you said, to think about taking those chances to answer earlier questions. First of all, statistics show that students on the multiple choice actually do better on the earlier part of the course than they do on the later part of the course. So I thought about that, and why is that the case? So my take on it is that when you teach the Renaissance, you are continually reteaching the Renaissance as the baseline intellectual movement when you cover other intellectual movements. And the second half of the course, let's say after 1945 or even the entire 20th century, many teachers are hurried and they go very quickly. So students get like one pass at the intellectual developments post 1945. So they might think that they understand it because they recently covered it, but the chances are they actually understand the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the Scientific Revolution better. And so I would just say, when all things are equal, I'd probably go with an earlier question in the course if you have that opportunity than something that you might have rushed through more recently, especially if you've studied for the exam in the appropriate way.
Yeah, and I think that what Chris has mentioned as well, drawing these connections, like if you think about Renaissance humanist philosophy, where, they're looking back at the classical tradition and kind of discarding a lot of the medieval thought, the Enlightenment kind of takes from that, in the sense that they all revere the Greeks and the Romans, and, not so much on that like medieval tradition, except for the Enlightenment people. They think that they've gotten past, the Greeks and the Romans, whereas the Renaissance, they look up to the Romans. They think, okay, maybe we'll get there. The Enlightenment uses a lot of the same assumptions, but they feel like, okay, we finally passed them up. Now, Chris, I've got a question from a teacher. Now, speaking of, Mr. O'Neill has asked, it's like a lot of teachers are thinking at this time, like, okay, the exam's coming up. Now, he's saying, I don't think he should be as panicked as he is. He says they're wrapping up World War I right now. So he's asking like for some key things to teach after World War I. Now, unless you're snowed in the Northeast, I think you've got plenty of time to finish the course at a pretty deliberate pace. But Chris, if you were having to prioritize some things from the 20th century, what would, and especially maybe some of that post-World War II stuff, what would you advise?
Yeah, I think that's probably where a lot of teachers are right now. I think that's still pretty good shape. I would say, for the period, the so-called interwar period, I'd kind of touch on some of the effects intellectually and culturally of the Great War. Then I'd certainly talk about the development of totalitarianism and the difficult and diplomatic and political framework of Europe after that. I wouldn't spend a lot of time with battle history in World War II. To me, more important there is the way in which the war changes the relationship of the state to the economy and to society, and some of the social effects of World War II. And then the post-1945 period, which I think often gets short shrift. I'd obviously talk about the Cold War, the separate development of Eastern and Western Europe, and then try not to forget some of the social developments like the development of the welfare state, changes in the demographics of Europe, the second wave feminism, and then maybe tie in with a little intellectual movements. But again, that reminds me is the test cannot have any required content after 2001. So there could be stimulus material after 2001, but not if it requires actual content knowledge. So that's another way it kind of limits the chronology of the course and might give some teachers a little feeling of cushion or relief that they don't have to bring things up to the very present. It's not like they have to talk about Brexit. If a student wants to use as an example on an essay, that's fine. But they don't have to talk about current events. I think, 9/11 would be the terminal point of the course.
Okay, so Chris, like, there could be, I guess, because I've seen like sometimes for SAQs or LEQs or whatever, when they say to present, what they're saying is that the student can use things past 2001, not necessarily that they would be forced to use things past.
Yeah, well, this is a new, I mean, this is one of the changes they made over this past summer. So I don't know that we've seen too many questions that have that new parameter to it. But a student is always welcome to use something beyond 2001 if it's a relevant example to illustrate the theme or the concept that's in the question. But they're not required to know that. So it wouldn't really be the best use of a teacher's time to obsess over the most recent 15 or 20 years, because that's not going to be required on the exam.
All right. And I think also, like, Chris said that, especially after World War II, a lot of that stuff that is less like glamorous and such, like I was actually, scoring the LEQ a few years ago that they had on the welfare state after World War II. And that was, wow, that was a few days that were just, wow. But that's the essay topic. It was just the welfare state after World War II. Now, one person's asking me about liberalism and socialism. Now, one thing that I think is one of the most important understandings for somebody to get from AP Euro is an understanding of 19th century classical liberalism. Now, especially in the United States, right-wing terminology tends to use the words liberalism and socialism interchangeably. And so when students come into the course, they don't really understand what liberalism means from a European mentality. And so, it's like the 19th century classical liberals would have a lot in common with some, people who in America identify themselves as libertarians today, in the sense that they want less regulations on the economy. Whereas in the United States, we tend to think of someone who's liberal as wanting more government interference. And so, for example, if you go to the Wikipedia page of the United States Republican Party, one of the issue positions says economic liberalism. Okay, so the liberalism in the United States is typically what they refer to in Europe as social liberalism, which is free speech, no discrimination against people because of sexual orientation, race, stuff like that. But the biggest thing is understanding that that in Europe, economic liberalism means basically a free market economy. Now, of course, today, like somebody who's a European liberal isn't totally laissez-faire, but they typically prefer less government interference, whether that be in economic life or social or political life. And so in the 19th century, especially, liberals and socialists are pretty much on opposite ends of the spectrum, because liberals being individualist and socialists being in terms of, they want to start with what's best for the group rather than what they think in terms of an individual's right, especially given private property and stuff like that. Chris, do you have anything to add to that? Anything that a student might, and I'm thinking too, they might want to note how some of these constructs are changing over time as well.
Sure. I was involved with the DBQ a couple of years ago on Bismarck, and the question was whether Bismarck represented a new type of conservatism or a traditional conservatism. And then the documents also had perspectives from liberalism and socialism. And I would just say that students struggled mightily in understanding these different ideologies. And I would just echo what you said, is that they don't necessarily mean the same things today that they did historically. So I would say that's a good area of study, because it also just gives you a broader understanding of the politics of the period and how these ideologies responded to the problems of industrialization and the challenge of the French Revolution. So not to harp on the course and exam description, but that's all covered in Key Concept 3.3, all lays out all the different ideologies you need to know with some examples from it. And I would just say, try to sit down and maybe kind of chart out what these ideologies believe when it relates to how legitimate governments are formed, the relationship of the state to the economy, questions of constitutions, guarantees of rights, and some of the other topics that you mentioned. And I think you'll benefit from that studying in areas beyond just questions related to ideologies. I think you'll understand politics and diplomacy and even intellectual and cultural developments better if you get into those ideologies.
Okay, and yeah, one of the, if I'm not mistaken, Chris, one of the themes of the course is the individual and society, right?
Yeah, and also the new theme of national and European identity certainly fits in with that, not just related to nationalism, but especially with nationalism.
Okay, and Caden, I want to note that I do have a video. My video on the Second Industrial Revolution compares the First and Second Industrial Revolution. I've got a little organizer where I go through all that. And yes, I am aware that I do still need to do an in-depth video on the First Industrial Revolution. I will get to that. I will work harder. All right. Now, Muhammad, what you need as far as evidence on the LEQ. Okay, now there are two evidence points on the LEQ, and of course, I've got the most recent. Okay, I've got the most recent rubric here. Now, of course, in Chris's supplement to his prep guide, he's got, he's got the, comparing the rubrics that are in his actual book with the way that it's been tweaked. All right, look at it. I got to know, wow, I'm ahead of the College Board right now. Thank y'all for helping me out, all you teachers and students going to my website. All right, so the AP Euro LEQ rubric. Now, when we think about pieces of evidence, now the DBQ only requires one piece of evidence. Now, the evidence, remember, as I said, it's not flashcard evidence. It needs to be related. It needs to be described. Like whatever you're trying to pass off as evidence, if you're not using at least two complete and substantive sentences, it's probably not evidence. Now, the LEQ has two evidence points here. Okay, so evidence and support for argument. Now, as far as it goes, it's been tweaked a little bit, but from the previous two readings, Chris, we've been told that when it says specific examples of evidence, that to score this point, they need two pieces of evidence, at least.
Yeah, so I was actually involved with the LEQ last year, and obviously this was using the rubric from the old rubric, because this one is obviously just 1 year old. But there was a contrast question of two different time periods in which war was waged. And what ended up happening is if a student had two examples from each period and they applied them to their argument, they earned the 2 points for use of evidence. So it's not just the amount of evidence, it's not just the quantity, it's also the way in which it is connected to the argument, which is what I think you just said. So if you just narrate, if you just dump out all of the content that you studied on that topic without any kind of relation to your argument, you are not going to earn the second point. You will earn the first point, but not the second point.
Okay, and now the thing is, Chris, are you saying that for the LEQ you were on last year, it was two examples for each period, or just two examples?
No, two. You would have earned the first point for just having two examples, just any two examples.
Okay, got it.
The second point, you have two examples from each part of the question because it was two different time periods, and you had to connect those examples, as you just said, to your argument rather than just mentioning them.
Okay, so Chris, even though, and that's one thing, we're still, they keep redesigning and tweaking these things. So, we're learning this as well. So Chris, as far as this second point, even though it doesn't say that there needs to be more volume, it's kind of understood on some level that most of those essays that get this second point on the LEQ, that they're going to use more than two pieces of evidence total.
Yeah, the second point, I think it really depends on the nature of the question. But yeah, they're probably going to be using more evidence than for just the first point. And qualitatively, they're going to be using that evidence in a way that suggests they know how to develop an argument rather than just recall content.
Gotcha. And so really, I think if they're trying to go for both of the evidence points, it's safe to say that they should count on using two examples to support multiple points, like using 4 examples total and kind of, showing that they've got, stuff to support every argument that they're making.
Right. So it partly depends on what the nature of the question. So let's say it's a causation question and they decide that there are two factors that explain whatever the topic is, the First World War or the French Revolution. Then they need to have two examples from each one of those causes that they discuss to show that they actually understand them.
Okay, well, excellent. And yeah, so remember, ladies and gentlemen, now notice here too that we see provides two specific examples of evidence relevant to the topic of the prompt. So, this doesn't necessarily need to be argumentative. But that's one big thing is like, the thesis driven writing versus the narrative driven writing, just telling a story. Now, one thing to note, one thing I've been noticing with my APUSH students, now remember, relevant to the topic of the prompt doesn't necessarily just mean at the same time as the prompt. Okay. So, make sure that, it is whatever you're using is directly relevant there. So, of course, the rubrics are available there on my website. And of course, Chris has got explanations in his book. We'll go ahead and take one. Let me find one more question before we, sign off. It's been a great time. Still got a lot of people here with us. All right, still over 200 viewers. Thank y'all for being here. Some of y'all have probably been here the whole time. So let me go back to Twitter and see what we've got here. Okay, so period 45 at Freiler period 45. They said, please tell Mr. Freiler we say hi. All right.
Okay, well that's nice. Thanks.
All right. So they're watching. All right. Tyrone Adair says hi. All right. Starkville, Mississippi. Oh. Always glad to see y'all. Yeah, Mr.
I know Ty.
Adair. All right. And so let's see. Teacher here. To what extent prompt still possible? If so, must a student be specific with degrees in the thesis, or can it show it in body paragraphs? That's not a bad thing to that's not a bad thing to look at here at the end here with Kevin's question. Chris, and this is something that I think confounds students and even teachers to an extent, since the exam keeps kind of, it's kind of a moving target. What are really, like, when you're looking generically, I know it matters, going from prompt to prompt, but generically, what are you usually looking for to determine if something is in fact a thesis?
So are you talking about a specific continuity and change question, like the degree to which?
I think just in general, like what he's saying here, he's asking about the degrees in the thesis. Okay, so is it necessary for a student to say, like, when it says evaluate the extent to which it, this changed this? If the thesis says, does the thesis have to give a degree that it changed, or if that's evident in the, in the writing, is that going to be enough? So yeah, I think he is getting into the continuity and change.
Right. I wouldn't just say, I think it's dangerous to say to a great degree or to some degree. I just don't think that really is very informative. To me, a thesis has to be informative. It has to tell me something that I didn't know before. And I just feel like any person off the street who hasn't taken AP Euro, who doesn't even know the topic, could come up with, to some degree, to a little degree, to a great degree. So I think the student needs to give reasons. So let's say if you were asking, since World War I has come up a couple of times, to what degree did World War I change European politics and diplomacy? I think I would try to adopt a word that suggests that you really understand the significance of the topic, like, transform European diplomacy by upsetting the balance of power, or transform European politics by opening the door for extremists and totalitarian governments. To me, that gives a reason, while also this at the same time taking a position on the issue. So I wouldn't fall into the trap of giving some kind of vague, sort of almost numerical or quantitative assessment. I would give a reason, and then try to demonstrate why the topic is important. And then in a question like that, the way that you can earn the complexity point is to deal with the continuities. So you could deal with the changes as your thesis and your argument, and then you deal with the continuities to demonstrate that you're doing that second part of the analysis and reasoning, which is the complexity that understands that there's a different part of the question, a different argument to be made there.
Okay, yeah, it reminds me of today when I gave an LEQ prompt to my APUSH students just to see what they would what they would write, generate a thesis, and I asked, like, to evaluate the extent to which technological advancements fostered change in the economy, and some of them for their thesis. I mean, we still got a few more months to fine tune this, but they were like, it made it better. And it's like, no, that's not acceptable. That it really is, the most important thing is the reasoning. Okay, so how did it make it better? I usually, for me, the litmus test is typically when I'm reading something and I'm trying to think about the thesis. It's like Chris said, it tells him something that he didn't already know. I look for how and or why. And if somebody's trying to pass something off as a thesis and it doesn't answer how something happened and or why something happened, then you need to go back, because in that case, you're not explaining something. You're just, making a statement that can't really be backed up. So, ladies and gentlemen, just again, one more time, just want to point out here that Chris Freiler is an AP Euro teacher in Chicago, Illinois, and he has written a great book. He's got great experience with the exam. He's occupied all kinds of positions. He was, involved in the redesign of the exam. In fact, he was a year late getting to the table with this prep book because of contractual obligations, I think, because he'd been so far on the inside of the development of this exam. So Amazon.com, it says temporarily out of stock, but there are some people that, that have gotten something anyway from there. So you're welcome to look there. Now, of course, you can go to the publisher's website and order directly. It's cheaper there. There may be a shipping charge, but you are also kind of guaranteed to get your book. We know that it's in stock with the publisher. And don't forget, should you purchase this prep book, to take a look at this supplement that's available on my website that Chris has put out there. Now, remember, those of you on my email list are going to get a sample, a sample excerpt from this prep book, so that you can have that whether you buy it or not. And so as far as that, now remember, I've got the Romulus Review app, 8-month writing clinic. Make sure when you watch my videos on YouTube, that you watch the ads. It may make me a penny or two or something like that. So thank you very much again, Chris, for joining me. Any last words of advice for the students before we sign off?
No, well, just one quick word on the Amazon. I actually contacted them and they said they had a shipment coming from the publisher. It should be there any day. So I think if a student orders it, they would probably get it just as quickly as if they ordered it from the textbook publisher, but either one is good. No, I would just say I agree with your 10-week plan. I think a high stakes test like an AP exam is something that you need to really break down. And I would just say, you noted timelines. I would make timelines of the 6 course themes, and that really helps with contextualization. And it just gives you that big picture overview, which just gives you a chronological framework and allows you to make connections more easily across time periods, which is so important in writing to those rubrics. And also on the multiple choice, just eliminating options that are incorrect. So I'd start with the big picture, get the overview, and then you can start pulling up some of those more details. But you can definitely improve your chances of success on the exam by just kind of sitting down and breaking down the studying of the course into manageable chunks.
All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Chris. And of course, as the exam gets closer, I will be broadcasting more often. I'll be providing things to people on the email list. Maybe I'll get around to making that video on the Industrial Revolution. But thank you all so much for joining us. And I will be back soon with more AP Euro Review. It's always a pleasure.